There's something profoundly humbling about slipping on a pool of salsa in front of 50 strangers, most of whom are young enough to call you sir. One minute, I'm standing in line at a trendy taco bar, holding a plate of something I can't pronounce, feeling every inch the fish out of water I am. The next, I'm flat on my back, legs in the air, covered in spicy tomato puree, staring up at a woman with a laugh so loud, the entire place turns to look. Are you alright? She asks, her voice somewhere between genuine concern and trying not to laugh again. I sit up, or try to, at least, and wave her off, though I can feel the heat of embarrassment crawling up my neck. Oh, I'm fine, I say, trying to maintain a shred of dignity. Just practicing my floor routine for the next Olympics. That earns me another laugh, and honest to God, head thrown back laugh. She kneels to help me, her long, auburn hair brushing her cheek. You might want to avoid the salsa next time. It seems to have a grudge against you. I look at her, mid-30s, effortlessly stylish, and somehow not at all concerned that she's crouching next to an older man who just performed the least graceful wipeout in taco bar history. Well, I manage, brushing salsa off my trousers. I've always preferred guacamole, but it's good to know the salsa community doesn't want me back. She smirks. I think you've been banned for life. At this point, a waiter rushes over with a mop, and a handful of college kids at the next table are trying very hard not to laugh. I'd crawl under the table if I thought my knees would let me. I'm Sophie, by the way, she says, extending a hand as if meeting like this is the most normal thing in the world. Frank, I reply, shaking her hand. My palm is sticky, and I realize too late that I'm still holding a piece of tortilla chip. Her eyes drop to the chip, and I see the corners of her mouth twitch. Nice to meet you, Frank. Are you always this graceful? Only when I'm trying to impress someone, I say, standing up slowly and feeling my back protest. I'm not sure what possessed me to joke like that. Maybe it was the way she was looking at me, not with pity or condescension, but with genuine amusement, like I was some sort of delightful oddity in her otherwise normal day. Well, you've certainly made an impression, she says, standing too. A memorable one, at least. She picks up her tray and starts walking back to her table. I watch her go, thinking that's the end of it. A funny little moment I'll relive in my head later when I'm lying awake at 3 a.m. But then, she turns around. Hey, Frank, she calls. If you're brave enough to face the salsa again, I'm over here. And just like that, my very ordinary Tuesday took a turn I never saw coming. I never thought I'd find myself standing in a taco bar with salsa on my trousers, considering whether to sit down with a woman half my age. But there I was, staring at Sophie across the room while my brain waged war against itself. On one hand, I was already humiliated. How much worse could it get? On the other hand, what business did I have sitting with her? She was young, confident, and seemed completely at ease in a world I didn't understand. But then Sophie caught my eye again, raised an eyebrow, and gestured to the empty seat across from her. Her casualness about the whole situation unnerved me. Was she doing this as a joke? Was she just being kind to the old man who'd made a spectacle of himself? Before I could think better of it, my feet moved on their own. I picked up my tray, what little food hadn't ended up on the floor, and made my way to her table. You're braver than I thought, she said as I sat down. Bravery's just stubbornness with better PR, I replied. She laughed at that, which threw me off balance. I hadn't expected her to actually laugh at anything I said. I glanced at her plate, some sort of fancy-looking tacos piled high with ingredients I couldn't name if you paid me. My own sad, soggy taco sat on my tray like it was ashamed to exist. Do you come here often? She asked, and I nearly laughed myself. Not exactly, I said. I was supposed to meet my friend Gary. But he canceled last minute, so here I am. Alone. Covered in salsa. Living the dream. Gary sounds like a terrible friend, she said, taking a bite of her taco. Oh, he's the worst, I said. If he were here, he'd probably still be laughing at me. Sophie smiled at that, and for a moment, I let myself relax. Maybe this wasn't as weird as I'd thought. She didn't seem to be mocking me, and there was no sign of hidden cameras or anyone pointing and whispering. So, what do you do, Frank? She asked. I hesitated. It had been years since anyone asked me that question. I'm retired, I said. From what? Accounting. 40 years of spreadsheets, numbers, and audits. Riveting stuff. And you miss it terribly, I'm sure. Oh, absolutely, I said, deadpan. Nothing compares to the thrill of reconciling bank statements. That got another laugh out of her, and I found myself smiling despite my usual reluctance to let my guard down. What about you? I asked. What do you do? I'm a graphic designer, she said. Freelance. I work from coffee shops mostly. Well, when I'm not hiking or traveling. Hiking and traveling, I repeated. You must have a lot of energy. I do, she said with a shrug. It's either that or sit around waiting for life to happen. I figured I'd rather go find it myself. That hit harder than I expected. For years, I'd been doing exactly that, sitting around, waiting for something to change, but never making an effort to change it myself. Sophie must have noticed the look on my face because she tilted her head and said, "Did I say something wrong?" No, I said quickly. Just thinking. What about? How was I supposed to answer that? About how I've wasted the last 10 years of my life? About how you seem like you're from a completely different planet? About how different we are, I said instead. Different how? I gestured vaguely between us. This. You're here with your fancy tacos and your adventurous lifestyle, and I'm here with my soggy tortilla and a bad back. We're like a bad buddy comedy waiting to happen. She grinned. You say that like it's a bad thing. I like bad buddy comedies. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Sophie had this way of looking at you like she wasn't just hearing you, she was listening. Really listening. It was unsettling and strangely comforting all at once. So, why'd you decide to come here today? She asked. I shrugged. I don't know. Habit, I guess. I've been trying to get out more lately. Do things I wouldn't normally do. Well, you're off to a great start, she said, nodding toward my salsa-stained trousers. I couldn't help but laugh at that, and suddenly, the embarrassment didn't feel so heavy anymore. We talked for what felt like hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. She told me about her travels, hiking in the Rockies, backpacking through Europe, and her latest obsession with learning how to surf. I told her about my kids, my retirement, and how I'd accidentally set my garden shed on fire trying to light a barbecue last summer. To my surprise, she didn't seem bored. If anything, she looked genuinely interested, even when I told her about the time I spent 6 hours assembling a flat-pack bookshelf only to realize I'd built it upside down. By the time we finished our food, I was surprised to find myself reluctant to leave. Sophie had a way of making you feel like the most interesting person in the room, even if you weren't. Well, she said, standing up and grabbing her tray, thanks for joining me, Frank. You made my day a lot more entertaining. Likewise, I said, though I doubted I'd added much to her day beyond a bit of comic relief. As she walked toward the door, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to let her go, chalk this up as a strange but pleasant encounter and leave it at that. But another part of me, the part that had been sitting around waiting for life to happen, told me to do something I hadn't done in years. Sophie, I called out, just as she reached the door. She turned, her expression curious. Would you? I don't know, maybe want to grab a coffee sometime? If you're not too busy hiking or surfing, I mean. For a moment, I thought she was going to laugh, and I braced myself for rejection. But instead, she smiled and said, I'd like that, Frank. I'd like that a lot. She walked out before I could say anything else, and I stood there for a moment, feeling like I'd just leapt off a cliff without a parachute. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was falling. I felt like I was finally moving forward. The following Saturday, we met for coffee at a small cafe Sophie recommended. It wasn't the chain kind with names I couldn't pronounce, it was one of those independent places that served everything in mismatched cups and had chalkboard menus with whimsical handwriting. I arrived 10 minutes early because, well, I'm the kind of man who still believes on time means a bit early. Sophie arrived 10 minutes late, breezing through the door like she owned the place, her bag slung over one shoulder and a half-smile on her face. Sorry I'm late, she said, sitting down across from me like it was the most natural thing in the world. The train was running behind. Did you order yet? No, I admitted. I was waiting for you. Thought it'd be rude otherwise. She smiled. You're old school. I like that. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or just an observation, but either way, it put me at ease. We ordered black coffee for me, some oat milk latte concoction for her, and settled into what felt like surprisingly comfortable conversation. I asked her about her work, and she launched into an explanation about the challenges of freelancing. Her hands moved as she talked, expressive and full of energy. She mentioned deadlines, client calls, and her latest project designing a logo for a startup. I nodded along, not entirely understanding half of what she said but appreciating the way her enthusiasm lit up the space between us. What about you? She asked when she finally paused to sip her latte. What's retirement like? Quiet, I said honestly. I read a lot. Watch documentaries. Argue with my cat when he refuses to eat his dinner. You argue with your cat? He always wins, I replied, which earned a laugh. We fell into a rhythm. She'd ask a question, I'd answer, then turn the focus back to her. I learned more about Sophie in that one coffee date than I had about anyone in years. She was 35, the middle child of 3 siblings, and had grown up in a small seaside town. She loved hiking but hated camping, adored dogs but didn't have one because her flat was too small, and spent her free time trying to learn obscure hobbies like pottery or salsa dancing. Don't laugh, she said when I raised an eyebrow at the mention of salsa dancing. I'm terrible at it, but it's fun. You should try it sometime. Me? I asked. Salsa dancing? Why not? She said with a shrug. It's not like you have to be good at it. It's just about enjoying yourself. The idea of me salsa dancing was so absurd I couldn't even respond. Over the next hour, the conversation drifted into unexpected territories. We talked about travel, food, music, and books. She asked if I'd ever been to the US, and when I said no, she spent 5 minutes convincing me that I needed to see the Grand Canyon at least once in my life. I told her about a disastrous family road trip to Cornwall in the late 80s, and she nearly spat out her latte from laughing. It wasn't until the server came by with the bill that I realized how long we'd been talking. Should we split it? Sophie asked, reaching for her wallet. No, I said quickly. I've got it. You don't have to. I know, I interrupted. But I want to. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right. Thanks, Frank. As we left the cafe, the conversation naturally slowed, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt like a pause rather than an end. So, Sophie said when we reached the pavement, this was fun. You're not so bad for a guy who argues with his cat. I'll take that as a compliment, I replied. She smiled, and for a moment, I thought that was it. But then she said, Do you like museums? Sure, I said, though it had been years since I'd stepped foot in one. Good, she said. There's a new exhibit at the Modern Art Museum. It's weird, but I think you'll like it. Want to go next weekend? I didn't hesitate. Yeah. I'd like that. Over the next few weeks, Sophie and I fell into a strange but enjoyable pattern. We met up once or twice a week, sometimes for coffee, sometimes for something a little more adventurous. The Modern Art Museum turned out to be far stranger than I'd anticipated. One installation featured a pile of bricks, and another was just a blank white canvas. I made a comment about how my shed probably qualified as art by those standards, and Sophie laughed so hard she nearly got us kicked out. Another time, we went to a park and rented bicycles. I hadn't been on a bike in decades, and it showed. Sophie was patient, but by the end of the day, I was sore in places I didn't know existed. What's next? I asked when we sat down on a bench to rest. She grinned. You'll see. Her next turned out to be a food festival where she convinced me to try things I couldn't pronounce. Some of it was delicious. Some of it was not. Sophie took it all in stride, laughing at my reactions and daring me to try increasingly ridiculous dishes. Through it all, I couldn't help but notice how easily Sophie navigated the world around her. She was spontaneous and full of life, while I was cautious and set in my ways. But somehow, it worked. She never made me feel old or out of place. Instead, she seemed genuinely curious about my life and the way I saw the world. One evening, after a particularly long day out, we ended up back at the cafe where we'd had our first coffee. As we sat there, sipping our drinks, Sophie said something that caught me off guard. "You're different, Frank." "Different how?" I asked. "Different from most people I know," she said. "In a good way. You're thoughtful. You listen. You don't pretend to be someone you're not." I didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments weren't something I was used to, especially not from someone like Sophie. "I'm just me," I said finally. "And that's enough," she replied, her smile warm and genuine. In that moment, I realized how much Sophie had come to mean to me. What started as an awkward meeting in a taco bar had turned into something far more significant. It was the third month of seeing Sophie regularly when things started to feel complicated. Not bad, not forced, just heavier. Up until that point, we had been moving through this odd connection between us like we were figuring out a puzzle. Each meeting added another piece. But now, the picture was starting to look like something real, something bigger than just coffee, tacos, or bad museum exhibits. And with that came questions. The first sign came one Sunday afternoon. We were sitting at a small Italian restaurant Sophie liked, splitting a pizza and joking about my complete lack of adventurous taste in toppings. "Pepperoni," she said, shaking her head with mock disapproval. "You realize there's a whole world of possibilities out there, right? Mushrooms, artichokes, goat cheese." "I like what I like," I replied. "Besides, some of us didn't grow up with 20 different toppings to choose from. When I was a kid, if someone said pizza, you got plain cheese and were happy with it." "Fair point," she said, leaning back in her chair. "But you're not a kid anymore, Frank. Time to branch out." Her tone was teasing, but the words struck a chord I wasn't ready to deal with. It wasn't just about pizza, and we both knew it. As we left the restaurant and walked back to the station, Sophie's phone buzzed with a message. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and her expression shifted just for a second. It wasn't dramatic, but I noticed. "Everything all right?" I asked. "Yeah," she said quickly, sliding the phone back into her pocket. "Just my friend Rachel checking in. She thinks I'm crazy for spending so much time with you." She said it lightly, like it didn't matter, but it landed like a punch to the gut. "Oh," I said. It was all I could manage. Sophie stopped walking and turned to face me. "Don't take it personally. Rachel's protective. She thinks I should be dating someone my own age, someone who can keep up with me." "And she's not wrong," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "I mean, look at us. I'm a retired accountant, and you're out here climbing mountains and designing logos. It doesn't exactly scream perfect match." She frowned. "Is that how you see it?" "I don't know how else to see it," I admitted. "You've got your whole life ahead of you, and I've already lived most of mine. At some point, that's going to matter, whether we want it to or not." Sophie didn't respond right away. She looked at me like she was trying to figure something out, her expression unreadable. "Can we not do this now?" she said finally. "Let's just enjoy the day." I nodded, but the words lingered between us for the rest of the afternoon. The doubts didn't stop there. A week later, I had dinner with my son, Peter. We don't see each other often, he's busy with his career, and I try not to hover, but we make an effort to meet up every few months. "So," he said halfway through the meal, "are you seeing anyone?" I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Sort of," I said finally. Peter raised an eyebrow. "Sort of? What does that mean?" "It means I've been spending time with someone," I said. "Her name's Sophie." He nodded, waiting for me to continue. "She's younger," I added. "How much younger?" 35. Peter stared at me, fork halfway to his mouth. You're joking. No. He put the fork down. Dad, that's. I mean, come on. What are you doing? I felt my defenses go up. What does it look like I'm doing? I'm spending time with someone I enjoy being around. But she's 35, he said, like I hadn't already established that. She's closer to my age than yours. And what could you possibly have in common with her? The question stung, mostly because I didn't have a good answer. We get along, I said. We make each other laugh. Isn't that enough? Peter sighed, shaking his head. I just don't want you to get hurt, Dad. Or embarrass yourself. Thanks for the vote of confidence, I said, my tone sharper than I intended. I'm serious, he said. Have you thought about how this looks? What people might say? People like who? You? Peter didn't respond right away, and the silence spoke volumes. I appreciate your concern, I said after a moment. But I'm not asking for your permission. Peter dropped the subject after that, but the conversation stuck with me. As much as I wanted to dismiss his concerns, I couldn't shake the feeling that he might be right. The breaking point came on a Wednesday night. Sophie and I had planned to meet at a wine bar she'd been wanting to try, but when I got there, she wasn't alone. This is Rachel, Sophie said as I approached the table. Rachel was everything I'd expected, polished, confident, and clearly unimpressed by me. She didn't bother to hide her skepticism either. So, she said after the obligatory pleasantries, you're Frank. That's me, I said, forcing a smile. I've heard a lot about you, she said, her tone making it clear she wasn't thrilled about it. Good things, I hope. She didn't laugh. The conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. Rachel kept steering it toward topics she knew I wouldn't have much to contribute to: social media trends, music festivals, and the latest tech gadgets. Sophie tried to keep things balanced, but it was obvious Rachel was testing me. When Sophie got up to use the restroom, Rachel didn't waste any time. Look, she said, leaning forward, I don't know what you think this is, but it's not going to work. Excuse me? You're a nice guy, Frank. I get it. But you're not what Sophie needs. She's young, ambitious, and full of life. You're not. I stared at her, stunned by her bluntness. That's not your decision to make. It's not, she admitted. But as her friend, it's my job to make sure she doesn't waste her time on something that's doomed to fail. Sophie returned before I could respond, and Rachel immediately switched back to her polite facade. But the damage was done. That night, as Sophie and I walked back to the station, I couldn't keep it in anymore. Is this how it's always going to be? I asked. What do you mean? People questioning us. Judging us. Thinking I'm some old fool trying to relive his youth. Who cares what people think, she said. I care, I admitted. Because they're not wrong. I am old, Sophie. And I don't know if I can keep pretending that doesn't matter. She stopped walking and looked at me, her expression serious. It only matters if you let it. I wanted to believe her. But as I stood there, I realized I wasn't sure if I could. The days following that uncomfortable conversation with Sophie were some of the most restless I'd had in years. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head: Rachel's blunt remarks, Peter's skepticism, and even my own doubts that had been building ever since Sophie and I first started spending time together. I didn't contact her immediately. For the first time in months, I felt like I didn't know how to talk to her. Instead, I spent a lot of time alone, pacing the house, arguing with myself over whether I was being an idiot for even considering this relationship or for even thinking of ending it because of what other people thought. A week passed before I worked up the courage to call her. Frank, she answered, her voice instantly warmer than I deserved. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. You okay? I've been better, I admitted. But I was hoping we could talk. Face to face. She paused for just a moment before answering. All right. Come by my place tonight? I agreed, though the idea of stepping into her space felt more daunting than ever. Sophie's flat was as I expected, small but full of character. The walls were lined with bookshelves crammed with novels and knickknacks. Plants hung from hooks by the windows, and a half-finished canvas leaned against one corner. "Wine?" she asked, already holding a bottle and 2 glasses. I nodded, sitting down on her worn sofa. She poured us both a glass and sat beside me, her expression calm but curious. "So," she said, setting her wine on the coffee table, "what's on your mind?" I took a deep breath, feeling like I was walking into a conversation I couldn't win. "I've been thinking about us. About what we're doing." "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "It's not that I don't care about you," I continued. "I do. More than I thought I would. But I can't stop wondering if we're just setting ourselves up for heartbreak." She frowned. "Because of the age difference?" "Because of everything," I said. "Your friends don't approve. My son doesn't understand. And honestly, I'm not sure I blame them. You're in your prime, Sophie. You could have anyone you wanted. Someone your age. Someone who fits into your world without all this baggage." "Baggage," she repeated, her voice sharper now. "Is that what you think you are?" "I think I'm realistic," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "I don't want to hold you back. I don't want to be the guy you settle for because it's convenient or interesting for a while." Sophie stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. "Do you honestly believe that's how I see you? As a placeholder?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Sometimes, I wonder if you've really thought about what this would look like long term. If you'd still want to be with me when things aren't fun and easy anymore." She set her wineglass down and folded her arms. "You think I haven't thought about it? Of course I have. You think I don't know what people say about us? I hear it all the time. From my friends, from strangers who give us side eyes when we're out together. But I don't care, Frank. Because none of that matters to me." "It will eventually," I said. "Maybe not now, but down the line, when I'm slowing down and you're still trying to live your life." "It'll matter then." Sophie shook her head. "You don't get to decide that for me. You don't get to tell me what's going to matter in the future. That's not how this works." Her words hit harder than I expected. For the first time, I realized how much I'd been projecting my own fears onto her, assuming I knew what she wanted, or what she'd eventually want, without ever actually asking. "I just don't want to be a mistake you regret," I said quietly. She reached over and took my hand, her grip firm. "You're not a mistake, Frank. The only thing I'd regret is you walking away because you're too scared to believe this could work." We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling around us. I could feel the pull to say something, to find some resolution, but for once, I didn't have the words. After what felt like an eternity, Sophie finally spoke again. "Look, I get it. This isn't easy. It's complicated, and people are always going to have opinions. But if we let them decide for us, we're letting them win. And I don't know about you, but I'm not interested in living my life based on what other people think." Her words stayed with me long after I left her flat that night. The following week, I decided to stop avoiding the problem and start facing it. I reached out to Peter first, inviting him over for dinner. "All right," he said, sitting across the table from me. "What's this about?" "Sophie," I said bluntly. He sighed. "Dad." "No, listen," I interrupted. "I know you're skeptical. I get it. But you don't have to understand it. You just have to respect it." "It's not about respect," he said. "I'm just worried about you. What if this doesn't work out? What if she decides you're too old and leaves? And what if she doesn't?" I countered. "What if I spend the rest of my life wondering what could have been because I was too afraid to try?" Peter looked at me, clearly unsure of what to say. "Look," I said, softening my tone. "You don't have to like it. But I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing. Can you do that for me? He didn't answer right away, but after a long pause, he nodded. Yeah. I can do that. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. The harder part was addressing my own doubts. I spent hours thinking about everything Sophie had said about what mattered to her, about what she wanted from this relationship. For so long, I'd been assuming that I was the one making sacrifices, that I was the one taking a risk. But the truth was, Sophie had been just as vulnerable as I was. She'd been fighting just as hard to make this work. And I owed it to her to stop second-guessing everything and meet her halfway. The next time we met, it was at the same cafe where we'd had our first coffee. Sophie was already sitting at a corner table when I arrived, her expression cautious but hopeful. "Hey," I said as I sat down. "Hey," she replied. We didn't waste time with small talk. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I said. And I was wrong, I admitted. About everything. About assuming I know what you want. About doubting whether we could make this work. I let other people's opinions get in my head, but the truth is, none of that matters. What matters is you and me. And if you're willing to fight for this, then so am I. Sophie didn't say anything for a moment, but the relief in her eyes was unmistakable. "Good," she said finally, a small smile forming on her lips. "Because I'm not ready to give up on us." It's strange how quickly life can shift when you stop fighting against it. Sophie and I had spent months tiptoeing around the question of whether we were right for each other, me fixated on our differences, her determined to prove that they didn't matter. But once I finally got out of my own way, things started to feel simpler. Not easier, relationships never are, but clearer. The weeks following our conversation at the cafe marked a change for us. Instead of constantly second-guessing everything, I leaned into it. I let myself enjoy the time we spent together without overanalyzing what it meant or where it was headed. Sophie, as usual, had no trouble being present. She approached life with a kind of confidence and ease that I envied. But just because I'd decided to embrace the relationship didn't mean the world around us magically fell into place. The first real test came when Sophie invited me to meet her family. "It's my dad's birthday next weekend," she said one evening as we sat on my sofa, sharing a pizza. She'd finally convinced me to try goat cheese and caramelized onions. I wasn't a fan, but I didn't tell her that. "Big milestone?" I asked. 60, she said. I froze for a moment, the weight of that number hitting me like a freight train. Her father was 60. I was 68. It was one thing to joke about our age difference in private, but the idea of sitting across the table from a man who was only 8 years younger than me and was also her father made my stomach churn. "You don't have to come if you're not ready," Sophie said, sensing my hesitation. But I knew that wasn't an option. If I was serious about this relationship, I couldn't keep avoiding the parts that made me uncomfortable. "I'll be there," I said, hoping I sounded more confident than I felt. The day of the party, I found myself standing outside her parents' house with a bottle of wine in one hand and a sense of impending doom in the other. Sophie squeezed my arm reassuringly. "They'll love you," she said. I wasn't so sure. Her parents, Margaret and David, were welcoming enough. Margaret was warm and chatty, asking me about my retirement and my interests, while David stood back, observing me with the quiet scrutiny of a man who'd spent decades perfecting the art of intimidation. The rest of the family was less subtle. Sophie's older brother, Ethan, made no effort to hide his skepticism. "So," he said as we stood by the barbecue, "how exactly did you two meet?" "At a taco bar," I said simply. "And you hit it off?" "Eventually." He raised an eyebrow. "No offense, mate, but you seem different from the guys Sophie usually dates." "That's probably true," I said. "What makes you think this is going to work?" The bluntness of the question caught me off guard, but I appreciated his honesty. "Because we make each other happy," I said. "And isn't that what matters?" Ethan didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Sophie, who was laughing with her younger sister across the garden, completely at ease. Finally, he nodded. "Fair enough." David, on the other hand, waited until the end of the evening to pull me aside. "I'll be honest," he said, his tone measured. "When Sophie told us about you, I wasn't sure what to think. But seeing her tonight, I haven't seen her this happy in years. So whatever you're doing, keep doing it." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. While meeting Sophie's family was a hurdle, the real challenge came when Sophie met Peter. We arranged to have dinner at my house, a neutral setting where Peter would feel more comfortable. I spent the entire day cleaning, scrubbing surfaces I hadn't thought about in years and wondering if I was making a mistake. Sophie arrived first, bringing dessert and her usual sense of calm. Peter showed up 10 minutes later, and the first few minutes were about as awkward as I'd feared. "So," Peter said as we sat down at the table, "how long have you two been seeing each other?" "About 4 months," Sophie said. Peter nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. The conversation was stilted at first, with Peter asking polite but pointed questions about Sophie's work, her hobbies, and her plans for the future. To her credit, Sophie handled it all with grace, answering honestly without letting his tone rattle her. It wasn't until halfway through the meal that Peter's guard finally started to drop. Sophie mentioned her failed attempts at learning to surf, and Peter, who'd tried surfing during a holiday in Australia, laughed for the first time all evening. By the end of the night, the atmosphere had softened considerably. As Sophie left, Peter pulled me aside. "She's different from what I expected," he said. "In a good way?" I asked. "In a good way," he confirmed. The months that followed weren't without their challenges. There were moments when the age difference felt more pronounced, like when Sophie dragged me to a concert where I was easily the oldest person in the crowd, or when I had to explain to her what a Rolodex was. But there were also moments that reminded me why this relationship was worth fighting for: quiet evenings cooking dinner together, long walks through the park, and the way Sophie never let me take myself too seriously. One evening, as we sat on my back porch watching the sunset, Sophie turned to me and said, "Do you ever regret it?" "Regret what?" I asked. "Us starting this." "Not for a second," I said. She smiled, and for the first time in a long time, I felt completely at peace. Looking back, I realize how much I've learned from this experience, not just about relationships, but about myself. For years, I let fear and doubt dictate my decisions. I told myself I was too old, too set in my ways, too far past my prime to take risks or try new things. But Sophie taught me that life doesn't have to stop just because you've hit a certain age. She reminded me that happiness isn't about fitting into other people's expectations, it's about finding the things and the people that make life worth living. Now, when I think about the future, I don't see a timeline of dwindling possibilities. I see potential. I see growth. And most importantly, I see Sophie by my side. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this: you're never too old to start again.